Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Trafford, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
Today's guest is Maya Zlatanova. Maya is the CEO of TrialHub and FindMeCure. She's also the podcast host of Trials with Maya Z. In today's session, we'll be discussing feasibility and the factors that are most critical in the process, and what practical steps can organizations take to improve their feasibility and planning, and so much more. Thanks so much for coming on board and having a conversation with Ted and I. I've been looking forward to this. Before we dive into some of the questions that we've got posed for you, it'd be great to get a little bit of a background of how you arrived at this particular spot.
Where I am today, right?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And like I said, I very much enjoy your conversations. Hopefully we're going to have one fun conversation today as well. But
I'm sure.
yeah, it's a long story, but I'll make it short. By coincidence, I have no medical background. I've never run a clinical trial myself, but I started working for a clinical research software company many years ago. The guys won this great contract with the UK government, and they literally built the entire infrastructure for clinical research document exchange for the UK. And I was literally supposed to grow their business into German-speaking markets. And here you go. Like, that's how I started working in the clinical research space. And then after that, fell in love with the regulations part of things, training, working with lots of investigators and all sorts of professionals, certifying them on all the important regulations in the clinical research space. And TrialHub and FindMeCure, like the company FindMeCure and the product, again, it's a long story, but let's say it's my passion. It's my way of bringing real impact to the industry. At least that's what I hope we're achieving with the company and with all of our products. I've shared this story many times, but I guess that it never hurts saying it once again. Only when you're personally hurt, when you're in a situation where you really have to rely on clinical trials, that's when you rely that we all depend on clinical trials. In my case, that was my sister. Thankfully, she recovered. But that was we struggling to find clinical trial for her opened my eyes for how dependent we all are on clinical trials. Today, I'm also a mom of 2 kids. I've spent lots of time with patients, parents of patients with rare diseases. Once you realize that we dream of better healthcare, but better healthcare can only exist if we have better clinical research, you just simply can't stay and just observe. I mean, that's how I feel it.
Love it.
Were you going to say the same thing, Liam?
Action orientated, inspiring.
Yeah, no, it's always an interesting personal journey into clinical research, and you're absolutely right. There's such a need out there to make it easier for people to find clinical trials. And so, yeah, thrilled to have you on today. Really looking forward to this conversation. It's not the first time we've chatted.
Yeah.
But
hopefully not the last either.
Yeah, hopefully not the last, unless I say something really wrong today. But hopefully we won't go there. But one of the things I thought I'd like to kick off with was one of the things you've been working on is a series of interviews to better understand standard of care and its connection in clinical trials. And so I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about that journey and maybe a couple of really interesting things you learned from it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I started doing these interviews because it's been actually a couple of years of realization what happens actually. So at the beginning, when I started the company like FindMeCure, I exactly said the same thing what you said, that it's so hard for patients to access clinical trials. And as many, we kind of think that this is the biggest problem that we have in clinical trials. How can we make people aware of clinical trials? How can we improve access? How can we get to these patients, go remotely, and so on and so forth? But once I started working with patients, not just me, but my team as well, we realized awareness and access is not it's not probably the biggest problem. It's, let's say, the tip of the iceberg. But what's beneath in deep water actually is how do we position clinical trials? How do we even think about clinical trials? And not just patients, I'm speaking about the entire industry. For the sponsor, the clinical trials is obviously the only way they can get a new drug on the market, or let's say they just get the better value of their company and like probably out license like this value to another company. But then again, it's about selling more, right? Potentially, it's an investment. For the patient, is actually an alternative, and so this alternative is actually not feasible for the patients unless this alternative really resonates with the value proposition they truly care for. But that's not something that companies, not only sponsors, but CROs, the entire industry, they don't usually understand that what they're offering to the market, they're literally offering something to patients. And it comes with some value proposition. And for years, my team was supporting like these sponsors and CROs to understand better competitive landscape, like what are the other clinical trials doing, what are the sites available, how they perform, and recruitment rates, and so on and so forth, because that's what they are asking, right? And I was like, okay, well, let's help them get to these insights much faster and quicker, and like let's help them get more business and so on and so forth. But I realized they never ask, like, but what do the patients care for? And would they actually join this clinical trial, and why? And also the other realization was that because the clinical research market it's global, but also at the same time very US centric. And what I realized is that in many cases, decisions for clinical trials are done in the United States, and there is nothing wrong with that. And I don't want to offend anyone here, but but the truth is that when I speak with experts that are based out of the States, because you have such a specific healthcare system, so much different than anywhere else in the world, like they tend to forget, or let's say they tend to not think so much that in other countries, in other places of the world, people have access to different type of healthcare, and that influence their decision making. And when we started doing work on standard of care, because we built the first global standard of care database in the world, when we created that and we started showing that to companies, we actually started realizing that they haven't realized the problem and actually the challenge of not connecting your clinical trial value proposition and comparing this clinical trial value proposition with the current standard of care value proposition that patients actually have in their countries. And that's where I decided, okay, maybe we need to start speaking about it, no matter whether they have access to database or not. They should definitely implement this assessment of the local healthcare systems and access to treatment in order to really understand, besides competition and sites performance and recruitment rates, what else contributes to their success with their clinical trial or challenges. So that's the story.
That's great. So what in doing all these interviews, because how many interviews have you done now approximately?
So for the standard of care piece, I did probably around like close to 20.
Okay. And what were some of the really interesting things that came out of those interviews?
It's funny that you're asking, because we're now compiling just a very small piece of all these interviews like together with the
Yeah.
strongest like messages you should care. Um, it's very interesting because I always resonate with the patient stories. It's just
Yeah.
that's my mindset, let's put it that way. So I have to say that I resonated mainly with the messages around patients saying, hey, and when I say patients, I mix both patients and patient advocates, but let's say patient advocates who are working professionally to advise companies on how they should build their clinical trials, their protocols, to actually accept the patient's reality and make sure that this resonates with the patient's target that they actually with the target patients that they go after. And basically, their message was like, if you don't do that, you will face challenges. And it's pity that we have to educate you on that, where you should be proactively coming and asking, like for us. And that message resonates a lot with me. But at the same time, I have to say that it resonates, but also I feel like sorry about the whole situation, because I wouldn't say that pharmaceutical companies don't want to hear the patient's voice. So it's like we're in this ridiculous situation where patients want to be heard and pharma companies want to hear them, but the processes that are between them, process, I wouldn't say regulations, right? I'm not saying regulations. I'm saying
No.
processes,
Yeah.
timelines, and like expectations, and just the way pharma works in between prevents them on doing that. But probably the things that really resonated the most with other folks, especially folks from CROs and sponsors, are all these numbers. For example, one thing that Dan Sfera said, you expect, if you haven't considered the patient journey, and standard of care impacts the patient journey in a way, before you start your clinical trial, expect to triple your timelines and triple your costs and recruitment rates and so on and so forth. Because that speaks like pharma, and you just basically expect delays and failures.
It's so critical, isn't it? We make these decisions in isolation without really truly understanding the implications of them, right? So effectively what you're saying here is, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you've got a system that's in place that's misaligned. The processes in terms of getting access to patient voice, or alternatively to the standard of care, which then effectively means that you are translating what could work in part, I'm going to say, in the US to every other single country, in which every other country is completely different. So the only way to change that dynamic is to go back to pharma, biotech, CROs to say, listen, if you carry on doing it this way, the impact is going to be, it's going to 3x your timelines. Am I summarizing that?
Yeah, basically it will happen what happens for the last, I don't know how many, 20 years. We
30 years.
Read,
I've been doing it 30 years.
yeah,
It's the
so
same.
we've all read the Tubes Institute publications and, numbers of delayed claims. I don't need to quote that. Like, we all know what's happening. It's happening today. So basically, if we, like Einstein, I think Einstein said it. Probably we need to double check because I have a horrible memory. But I think Einstein said it's not stupid to actually make a mistake. It's stupid if you make the mistake twice, even though you knew you made a mistake. So basically, like, that's what we're doing in a way.
Don't do the same thing and expect a different result.
Exactly.
It's very true. Where do you see? Why do you think we don't recognize that as an industry more, or do you think we do? It's just there's too much incentivization, too much bias, too much cultural change that needs to happen. What is blocking us from doing it differently?
Have you read the Sapiens book? It became
Yes.
like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
super
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
so you know how humanity works and like how we all work. We need habits and
Yeah.
like it's hard. Like let's put it that way. Clinical research, it's hard, and we're dealing with people's lives and important decisions. So it is hard. I don't think it's something to do with culture. I mean, I don't think that we will change the way let's say the success rate of people changing their habits, because that's not just industry specific; it's human specific, right? So I don't think it's that. I think that the thing that's stopping us from like change that actually has a real impact is the really tough processes we have. The fact that this industry is driven by multiple stakeholders at the same time, each of them have slightly different incentives. In order to actually align these incentives all together, it is also pretty hard. I'm not saying impossible, but it's hard. In general, I think our industry is not the most collaborative, right? But I also have to say that some of the some of the smartest people work exactly in this industry. And I think people know, like people on an individual level, people know that we can do a better job or we should be doing a better job, right? So people know that engaging patients early is important. People know that you have to assess your protocol with the local standard of care. For example, they know that. It's super difficult to do that with the existing processes and with the existing tools. So, for example, even today, companies do go back to their, let's say, the big giants like Pfizer and J&J and so on and so forth. They would go and ask their local teams, hey guys, like tell me more about these patients, how they're being treated, and so on and so forth. But it's just a super manual process, a lot of back and forth communication with people whose priority is not providing you with this feasibility questionnaire precisely. Speaking to investigators, that's actually a big challenge. These investigator surveys, I'm going to understand the standard of care if I ask the investigators. Yes, great. Probably you could. But like how many like number of patients do you think you can recruit for me? I'm speaking about these inefficient processes that require a lot of back and forth of multiple stakeholders that end up with like huge deadlines and not actually helping us to get the information that we need as early as possible. Like patient engagement, I think I recently spoke to an awesome guy, Paul Sims from Impact Health, and he was saying he's consulting different companies on patient engagement and whatnot. And he said that for one patient advocate or a couple to be contracted and consult the pharma company, 6 months need to pass. The companies don't have this time. Imagine if you're a normal company, Google or Apple, and they have to wait for 6 months to get their prototype into the hands of their clients, in like not clients, but like potential users,
Advisors.
to
Yeah.
get feedback. Insane.
Yeah. The procurement process just takes forever at these companies.
Yeah, but the procurement is there for different purposes, so it
Right.
makes sense like to be there. So I guess that if we maybe go back to these processes that exist today and see what can we do to make them faster, less, let's say, heavy on communication and stakeholders, reliant on people, for example, or still on people, but let's say less people, for example. How can we make it easier to get to a better understanding of what will make or break your clinical trial beforehand? I hope that this will really make a change.
Yeah, I think it needs significant leadership at the pharmaceutical companies and at the CROs to really commit to the change. Everyone knows that enrollment is the biggest issue in clinical trials, or lack of enrollment, or slow enrollment, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, the commitment just isn't there, aside from throwing, money at a specific project to try and increase recruitment in that one study. We're not looking at the underlying root causes of why things are low. And we're going to continue to struggle unless we get some good leadership taking charge.
I kind of disagree here. I mean, don't get me wrong, probably there should be a little bit more leadership going out and saying like that's it. We need more patient engagement, or we need more alignment with patients, whatever like it is to say. But I think what's lacking is pressure. It's pressure on clinical research teams. And I've been speaking to lots of commercial teams. We work quite a lot with market access teams, especially around like the standard of care piece. And what they say is that the pressure that's on the commercial teams in pharma is way bigger than, for example, the pressure that's in clinical research teams. By definition, they know they will be late, and that's fine. And it's not fine, but they know that they will be late. So what's the pressure? Like, yeah, what will happen if you don't meet these deadlines, or if you don't engage with the patients, or I honestly, maybe that's a desperate measure, and maybe I'm totally wrong here, but I kind of like wait for the times where FDA will come up with like a requirement. We don't accept any protocols unless you've spoken to the patients in the countries that you've selected. I know that's not the role of the FDA, but maybe that's the only thing that will actually do the job.
But you bring up a good point there. We actually just published a 3-part article in Clinical Leader about this very thing, which is we don't necessarily take some of the best practices from market to trials. And I think that we almost need to be rethinking, like we spend a fraction on accessing patients and informing and educating doctors and so on and so forth, and researchers on the drug at the clinical trial stage, when in actual fact it would probably be useful to start doing that much earlier. And I do wonder, we sort of posing the question is, there's probably best practice to bring forward into those clinical trials, but also there's a question around investment, because I can't see in any other industry where our biggest issue is enrollment. And, to your point, like the vast majority of these studies are going to run long. We don't need to talk about stats and so on and so forth. But we really do invest a fraction into enrollment overall, because we're wired, I think, as an industry to focus more on the data collection, which obviously comes after patient access, than the upfront, to your point around what is the right strategy, what's the right design, where are we going from, what's the impact of these decisions on enrollment, and so on and so forth. And a rush to get to first patient rather than last patient is what I see constantly.
Yeah, I think maybe we don't spend enough time on doing our homework on how, like the strategy, the strategize piece. Also, I mentioned that earlier. This lack of collaboration, definitely, like we're simply not collaborative. I mean, we don't share when, for example, we have struggles with clinical trials, even like things like site performance. Like you will help so much if you share, but even not site performance. Like site performance also comes with other like things, the overall trial performance and all the lessons you learn from this trial. We don't share that for some reason. And I get it. That's your own IP in a way. Like it's kind of like a startup. Like all your lessons learned is your also your advantage. It's just that it'd be so much faster if we were to share at least the big lessons we've learned from running a clinical trial this way and that way, and like with this like population and so on and so forth. I think we heavily rely also on the doctors' perspectives, the investigators. Don't get me wrong; they're absolutely essential for clinical trials. No investigators, no clinical trials, right? But I think we fail to recognize that we live in a slightly new, different era where the first thing you do as a patient is open your phone and check, especially now with ChatGPT, it gets even worse. You get the diagnosis, multiple diagnosis before you go to the doctor. So I think that it just became even more complicated, not just clinical trials, but any healthcare product, device, procedure, treatment. People are way more empowered, no matter whether we want to listen to them or not, to listen to us or not. They have the voice, and they're the ones actually to decide at the end of the day. The doctors are still the consultants, and if they're yes, they're trusted consultants. Trust depends on country by country. There was actually one LinkedIn post recently on, actually, that's not really like trust is varies a lot depending on like different countries. So I think we should take away this focus from feasibility being only site feasibility and start doing feasibility the way we should define feasibility. Feasibility comes from feasible, and what we should be asking is, my clinical trial feasible? And then which are these perspectives that you have to take into consideration? Feasible from regulators' point of view? Yes, no. From statistical point of view, right? Because that's very important for data collection. From sites point of view, fair enough. Let's say market point of view with competition and like so on and so forth, and patient's point of view. If you don't consider these perspectives early on, then you have a blind spot and you just rely not on strategy, you rely on luck. Like one of our advisors say, and I love this quote, hope is not a strategy.
In Vegas, it might be, but not in clinical trials. Yeah, so let's dig into that for a second, because first of all, I agree. The way feasibility is currently done right now, you're not actually going to get the information you need, because by going out to sites during the site selection process and asking them questions about, do you see any issues with this trial? Well, who's going to say anything when they want to do the study and they want to get selected, but if they say something, they might not get selected. So I agree. We need to back up the process, and before the protocol is set in stone, we need to do a feasibility. So tell me more about this patient feasibility. How do you go about doing a patient feasibility?
Yeah. Before that, I actually want to emphasize on something. I think that the site feasibility is actually the questionnaires to the sites is absolutely essential. It's just like with any data, you have to take this, especially coming from someone, you have to take it with a piece of like salt, grain salt. The problem with the site questionnaires very often is not only the questionnaires themselves and like them saying yes or no, because there are sites and investigators that will come back with honest opinion, right? But sometimes the problem is that, again, in the process, this comes too late. So basically, I see the protocol development as a dance, literally as a dance. On one side, you have this like statistical significance drive. You want to get data in such a format, such data that when you go to the market and when you have to convince whoever is to reimburse your drug, pay for your drug, that you have solid data to back up that they should give you this money because it's better than, let's say, standard of care, or like cheaper or whatever your hypothesis is, basically. So this is on one side. On the other side is, let's say, the operational feasibility, this operational feasibility that I'm speaking about. whether your trial is actually feasible for the world, right? And very often we start with this, of course, we start with that's our hypothesis. And along the journey, you get insights on the operational feasibility, but these insights come a little bit late, let's say not as early to impact the protocol's decision making. And also they're coming to different teams. Sometimes the difficulty is not only when, but also who is going to deal with that. For example, in most of the companies, you have a dedicated team to deal with the patient engagement. You have a dedicated team to deal with the site's questionnaires and the site feasibility. And then a separate team that does the data, like the clinical science and biostatistics and so on and so forth. And because they do it like a waterfall effect, basically the first team, second team, third team. So you basically ask the third team to go back to the first team and say, guys, you didn't do a good job. Let's change dramatically what you decided, which is much harder if all together they come together and make an assessment the time and make it a dance, like I said, like make it in a synchronized way. So that also contributes to the whole like complexity. Speaking about patient feasibility, I have to say that we are still defining what patient feasibility is. And it's actually hard, Ted. Thanks for asking me this question, because feasibility as a term comes very often with this site feasibility. Like when you say feasibility, usually people think, oh, okay, so it's site feasibility. So when you say patient feasibility, what is actually that? I mean, I did try this with lots of people, and I can see people are feeling confused. But I'm very stubborn, and I continue speaking about patient feasibility because I think it's absolutely essential that we speak about patient feasibility as well. So I will tell you how I see patient feasibility. I see it as a basic patient feasibility that we kind of do today, and more of advanced patient feasibility that we should be doing. And we're starting. The basic one is where you simply understand if your protocol and your eligibility criteria and schedule of events and so on and so forth is feasible with the reality of patients, simply following their access to treatments, their, like, let's say, current procedures, like their journey in as part of the healthcare systems and so on and so forth. Is it feasible, let's say, to find these patients? Are these patients existing? Like, do these patients exist? Are they available? That's the first level. And I would say, as an extension to this basic level would be, all right, what's their access to treatments today? And how motivated would they be to actually prefer, let's say, a clinical trial versus the existing options? With some indications, no-brainer. With others, not sure. Depends on where you live, like, right? So that's kind of the absolutely essential patient feasibility that you have to be doing. I hear some patient, I'm not patients, I'm sorry, but companies call it patient eligibility modeling. So that's basically this basic patient feasibility that I speak about. Where we need to be going is on the more soft things, more on the motivational things, and more on the actual patient journey. Here we speak about things like patient burden. When introducing a clinical trial, we're asking a patient to join your clinical trial. Are you introducing a much bigger burden than what's the existing one? And actually, that's the caveat. I want to stop here because that's actually the mistake we're doing today. We speak about calculating the patient burden for at least couple of years now, and for the past 1 or 2 years, there are also like companies trying to provide that, to simplify how to get to this patient burden. But all we do today, or at least the majority of what I've seen, is trying to compare your clinical trial, your schedule of events, and like your clinical trial to past clinical trials or other clinical trials. And all you say is, my clinical trial is better than yours. Great. But whether clinical trials as a whole, how do they stand next to a standard of care, like the reality of the patient, is another story. But the truth is that the patient won't compare your clinical trial to the other clinical trials. The patient will compare it to what's today. What options do they have today? And not only what options, but what's their life today? And even if they want to be part of your clinical trial, can they afford it? I mean, Sam Whitaker, I'm mentioning him, but like he has this incredible campaign on raising awareness and changing the fact that a lot of American families simply can't afford financially being a part of a clinical trial. So understanding that and not comparing to other clinical trials, that's critical. It's not the other clinical trials. It's, can you afford that? Can you afford traveling to these clinical trials? Or actually, how willing are you to change your doctor? And like lots of different things, right? So I think this next level of patient feasibility should be about we compare understanding better the patient's reality country by country, especially in the countries which are like essential for us. I mean, all of the countries, to be honest. Patients deserve it. And really understand where is your clinical trial today compared to what's the reality for these patients, not just the treatments, but like depending on their economical status, like do they have kids? No. Like do they work and no, or so on and so on and so forth. And try to understand how does this fit into their existing reality at all? Is it feasible for these patients to actually participate and stay in this clinical trial long term?
Point. I think that it's something that most forget, which is effectively what you're doing with research is trying to integrate within healthcare in some capacity, because that's what you're, as you say, that's what you're competing against rather than the other trial. So I always think about this in like a 3-dimensional model in which that you've got standard of care, severity of disease as your two sort of like bottom, your x-axis, and then your y-axis is motivation levels. Because ultimately, if you've got a well-managed disease with current standard of treatment, so current standard of care, your motivation is probably likely to be low to go and try another drug, right? Whereas if you've got a very severe disease with no standard of care, you're probably very highly motivated to do something. And we don't take into account that type of model, as you mentioned, along with some of the other sort of social and also psychological factors that decision making, for instance, caregivers had. That it's a massive impact, right? If you've got particular, as you know, Alzheimer's disease, good one, you've got individuals that are making decisions on your behalf as well. So what are the psychological factors there to engage people into research as well?
Yeah, but I wanted to also add something here, because a lot of people think if it's a severe disease, that's it. Like patients are interested and they
No,
will stay in the trial. But
yeah,
that's not true, because
no.
I want to give you one example from it's a story actually that, yeah, now that I'm saying it, like, yeah, because it's about a kid with like a rare disease from Spain. And the family did everything possible for this kid to participate in a clinical trial. But this clinical trial, the hospital, like the site, is couple of 100 miles away from their home. And even though they agreed to participate and so on and so forth, the challenge is that this couple, these parents, they have a second kid. And exactly the time of the visit, of like when they were supposed to go and visit the sites, their second kid got sick, just flu or something like. But basically, the kid was sick. They couldn't travel. I mean, come on, they have a second, and it's, and then they want to participate, they want to stay compliant, but at the same time they can't. Like how can you make, in this story, the story actually was such that the investigator literally called the couple and like he shouted at them in a way, like, yeah. And actually no, I'm sorry, I misled you here. No, the investigator was actually very like wanted to accommodate them in one way or another. There was no chance for them to go, so they asked the pharma company to actually make like do something about it, and like just to accept that this is the case and do something about it and still allow this kid to continue in the clinical trial. But the pharma company was like kind of like shouting, do something about it, make sure that they come in time. What can you do as an investigator? What can you do as a parent in such a case? So yeah, sometimes having a severe disease doesn't say that's it, you're gonna do whatever they tell you, even
No,
go to jail or whatever, right?
absolutely. And as I say, there's other factors in there to be considered, because sometimes motivation can be so high, but in this instance there may have not been any other option. So therefore it's a case of a balance, right, with the farmer. I mean, there's no way farmers should be like, okay, how do we do this to make it sure it doesn't screw up the data and all the rest of it. But that's a real shame if we haven't got that caring type approach. Is upsetting, to say the least.
Yeah, which reminds me of something else that we are rarely discussing: expanded access. we thanks to our platform for patients like the FindMeCure.com, we serve lots of patients. We've served probably millions of people who asked us, like, tell us more about clinical trials, help us volunteer for clinical trials, and so on and so forth. And there were people who simply wanted to, actually, they couldn't, they were not good fit for the clinical trial per se, but they could benefit from expanded access. But that's not accessible at all. It's so difficult. I know there are companies specializing in that. I hope that they make a better job with really providing this expanded access. But yeah, I think we need to be thinking about with empathy to these people who are actually giving us a lot their data, especially in Europe. We have these regulations and like this mentality that data is actually quite important and quite wealthy, so we don't provide data just like that. But this data, and they're giving you also like the opportunity to grow your business like tremendously. So yeah, a little bit more empathy and thinking beforehand what may go wrong is important. And honestly, I've interviewed an incredible entrepreneur, biotech. She used to be a CEO of a biotech company, managed to do an IPO, had the success story, let's say. There is a podcast episode on the topic, and she did these, let's say, patients meetings, even though her like startup, she was a startup at the company, like not having much resources. She was doing the site engagement as well, all of these best practices, engage with the sites, engage with the patients, and she didn't have much resources. She didn't have bigger teams. So if she could do it, why not the rest?
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of the times there's I think just competing priorities that take over, and these important steps are pushed to the side or pushed to someone else, or just not, not truly addressed. Yeah. Wow.
Or sometimes it's just taking ownership. Like I said, if we as individuals decide not to ask and wait for someone else to do this, but we do it, for example, take responsibility for that. If we all actually think like that, I think that we'll have different results. The other way is just pressure. Unfortunately, history shows us that with pressure, we work better.
Yeah, it's very hard, isn't it? To I mean, there's so much, there's so much often that is just built for sort of jobs worth and to keep people keep themselves in their own roles and things. Just to your point around sapiens earlier, is that it's incentive caused bias by the fact that we're trying to self-preserve, which is totally understandable. But one question I do want to ask, Maya, is that how might some of these emerging technologies like AI and so on and so forth help improve some of the feasibility steps?
I'm a huge believer of that no technology is a solution on its own, right? But it's an enabler. And I do believe that AI is a great enabler of our industry because it can help across the board. If we go back to some of my answers before this one, I mentioned a couple of times that processes is actually what stops us from being fast, from achieving like better results and so on and so forth. And actually AI is really good at simplifying processes, giving us answers quicker, and getting us to let's say to like analysis quicker. So AI is it has a huge potential. When it comes to feasibility, well, even what we achieved with the standard of care, like literally structuring standard of care insights across the globe, like I think we covered like 70 countries in one place. That wasn't possible before having actually these new emerging like AI technologies. We tried, believe me, because like the moment we realized they're doing everything else, like the companies are doing everything else, but when it comes to standard of care, they want to. Again, I want to make sure that it's clear. People want, they are asking these questions. They just they don't know how, they don't have the time. And for probably a year or two, we were struggling. And then we realized how we can use these emerging technologies to actually achieve that. So that's a good example how suddenly, thanks to AI, we can answer teams much earlier in the process of thinking before they even have a protocol to, in few seconds, understand. Oh, so okay, that's how a patient with metastatic breast cancer is treated in Germany versus Bulgaria versus Spain versus the United States. Okay. So if I go to this country, maybe I won't find these eligible patients, or they will become eligible much later in their patient journey, and so on and so forth. So that's just one example. Another example is all these companies using AI to speed up the document like creation, and maybe making documents even more empathetic, to be honest, especially patient materials, but also site materials, giving like this possibility of more of a concierge service. One thing that I absolutely hated when we started the company FindMeCure.com was when we had to work with call centers of pharmaceutical companies. Even today, by the way, horrible experience. We had these cases where I'm calling. I actually called for my sister even beforehand. I'm calling to find out more about this clinical trial. Thank you very much for calling. Can you go and consult with your doctor? Well, if my doctor knew anything about this clinical trial, would I call you?
Yeah.
So ridiculous situation. But now, for example, there are these companies trying to work on like more of a concierge, more of a personalized approach with patients, and AI gives you this scalability, right? Is AI the cure? No, but cure AI is definitely something that can accelerate a lot of things and fill in lots of gaps if we are smart about the way we implement it, right? It has to be aligned with the pain, with the journey. It has to also have the right user experience. That's absolutely key. But there are multiple places where AI can help.
Yeah, I also think, just to add to that, there's a question always for me around the data that's being inputted, right? Because if it's trained on a, like as you said earlier, for instance, if we're not one for sharing information as an industry, I think there's something ridiculous like only 30% of publications are replicable or repeatable. So it's a case of, if we start training AI on particular information that is inherently human bias and so on and so forth, we are still going to get the same answers, which I think is a really interesting problem to solve. I want to how do you go about, as a total tactical and technical question, how do you go about finding out about standard of care using like AI?
Well, the AI won't help you with finding out like more about the standard of care. We
Yeah.
have a medical team for that.
Okay. Right. So it wasn't web
AI,
scraping and things
will
like that.
help you with, let's say, bringing the insights, but like the work, that there is a lot of work beforehand.
Sure.
Um, but it's like you need to have the expertise,
Sure.
and let's say we were very well positioned to have a skilled team, but also gather like a pretty good team, also backed by lots of advisors outside of that. For each of the countries, we had to have an additional advisor, and it was a lot of work, and it's still a lot of work, like mapping out each and every country, understanding their rationale behind allowing one drug to be approved and then reimbursed, and that what does it mean, like what institutions, like what's the entire workflow around that. So there was a lot of work, and AI was just one of the it's just one of the components that helped us automate the whole thing, so that once we did the mapping, we were able to automate everything after that, so that you have access to the freshest information, to the most accurate information, which is absolutely key, because if it's not, then you may make a mistake based on data that you're looking at. But going back, by the way, on the AI and feasibility, one very good use case is something that, I mean, there are a couple of companies doing that. A friend of mine is also like doing that, even allowing sites to reuse answers that they provided through site questionnaires. Like, come on, we all know about the site burden, right? So lots of things that AI can actually automate. Probably we need to, I actually, have you heard of any companies doing AI assistance for these like specialized AI assistance to sites? Maybe that's the next core here.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
It's definitely a good idea. I mean, it's one of those things. I think there's also a question of helping sites position themselves better to sell their services rather than just answering. We know that when we've spoken to groups before, that just giving an answer and not understanding the why behind it is really critical. And as you say, that when sites are super busy, that explanation can be a powerful tool, but just one that they haven't got time to do, because that can ultimately help them win or lose a study as a result. So That's super interesting, Maya. I'm hugely mindful of your time. Ted, any last questions? We've got like literally a couple of minutes left. Any questions from you?
I think, yeah, this has been amazing, Maya. Really appreciate you coming on today and taking the time to talk to us. How can people reach you if they want to reach you or your company? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
I think the best way is just like our website, TrialHub.com, or my LinkedIn profile, Maya Zlatanova. Guys, you can reach out to me, not because of the company per se, but if you just like are passionate about clinical research the way I am, making clinical research more aligned with patients, or if you want to challenge some of our ideas. I always say that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and the more we speak loud and transparent, the closer we are to doing something really impactful. So the more we unite and the more we speak as a community, I think the better results we're going to have. And thank you very much, both Liam and Ted, for creating this stage so that people can actually speak and providing their perspectives.
Yeah, no, more than welcome. And thanks so much for taking the time to be on. We'll undoubtedly have a part 2 of another session with this. So we look forward to rescheduling and talking again very soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Cheers, Maya. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye now.